Good evening and welcome to Colorado Decides, a joint production of Colorado Public Television and CBS4. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Joining me as always is political analyst Eric Sonderman. Our series continues tonight as we take a look at Proposition 105, which would mandate the labeling of certain foods containing genetically modified or engineered organisms. Join us for the next 30 minutes are Robin O'Brien, representing the proponents of Proposition 105, and Dana Bieber, representing the opponents of Proposition 105. Everyone, thank you very much for joining us. We have limited time, so let's get right to it. Eric, why don't you start us off?
Yes, welcome indeed. We'll have some tough questions as we go along, but let me start with a general one. Robin, will let you as the proponent go first. Can you give us succinctly what this proposition does and why you believe it's important? Why are we here today?
Yes on 105 gives Colorado families, food companies, farmers and ranchers information about our food today. In the last 20 years, a lot has changed with our food supply, and we have a whole bunch of new ingredients that didn't exist 20 years ago. And 64 countries around the world label these ingredients. And as a result of that, our own American food companies also label these ingredients in those countries around the world. So this proposition is simply bringing that same right, that same fundamental human right for a family to know what's going into the food that they're feeding their children, to Colorado families, to the Colorado economy, and to the Colorado farmers and community.
And Dana, I'm going to assume you have a different viewpoint. Can you tell us succinctly why you think this is a mistaken idea?
Well, certainly. You know, the proponents, to hear them talk about it, this is all about the right to know. And that's where Proposition 105 fails. It fails on its fundamental promise to provide accurate and reliable information to consumers about what's in their food. You know, the proponents start out by writing this proposition, and they started with a blank sheet of paper, and the very first thing they did is exempt 2/3 of the food and beverage that's sold in the state. These are indefensible exemptions. I mean, there's thousands of products that contain or are made with GMOs, but yet they get a special exemption, and they wouldn't have to be labeled. Meanwhile, there's thousands of products that actually don't contain GMOs in them, but they would have to be labeled as such. It provides inaccurate information. At the same time, it will increase the cost of groceries for all families, and it hurts the farmers of this state, and that's why they're all urging a no vote.
Well, Robin, let's start with answering that point. There are other foods exempted from this proposition. Why is that?
Well, you know, for the families that are actually from Colorado, and Dana may not know this since she's from Seattle, but Colorado state law requires that we only address one issue per amendment title at a time. So this is a reasonable first step. The speculation that it's going to drive up food costs for families, again, that's speculation. We've had this introduced in 64 countries around the world. American food companies are already doing it. We're not asking them to reinvent the wheel. Those 64 countries introduced this legislation without any increase in food prices.
Well, let's get a little bit deeper about if you're deciding whether it's, let's go with the information first. What is included, what would be labeled if this proposition passes, and then one wouldn't be labeled?
The things that would be labeled are the things that you find in a grocery store. What's hard to label at this point under this particular piece of legislation, because state law does insist that we only cover one issue at a time, is we can't cover alcohol, we can't cover food that's served in fast food restaurants. And so it really is a starting point. And again, you know, if we really want to address this issue, the thing we really should probably be tackling is that state law that is prohibiting us from taking on more than one issue at a time.
Well, but let's push a little bit. I just want to be very clear with folks on the food in a grocery store, because that grocery stores are huge. Does that include dairy and meat along with vegetables and fruit, the boxes of cereal? What if I'm walking around a grocery store after this, if this proposition passes, where am I going to see more labeling and where won't I?
That is actually a great question, because what most people aren't aware of is the fact that different categories of the grocery store are regulated under different agencies here in the United States. And for example, with the introduction of these genetically engineered products in the last 20 years, corn, for example, the Colorado farmers have been growing for 5 generations here in Colorado. That corn that has been genetically engineered with a Bt toxin to literally produce its own insecticide internally within the plant, that corn is now regulated by the EPA as a pesticide. And that difference is now patented by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So this kind of legislation simply gives a Colorado mom or a Colorado grandfather the right to know, is this corn the kind of corn that's been in our food supply for 5 generations, Or is this corn the kind of corn that now is regulated by the EPA as a pesticide?
Okay.
Dan, let's let you jump in here with, again, looking at the grocery store. Let's get with basic information. As you look at it, what labels in the grocery store are going to change? What wouldn't change?
Well, like I said, there about 2/3 of the food that is sold is exempt, and the proponents particularly put those exemptions in there. In fact, they argued for them in front of the state ballot title board, and they said that they chose to put those exemptions in there. So it has nothing to do with the two-part rule. They simply chose to put these exemptions in there. So for an example, all meat, milk, and dairy products that come from animals that were fed GE grains and injected with GE medications don't have to be labeled because there's a special exemption written into Proposition 105. And it's important to note that conflicts with federal labeling standards. Now, the federal organic label or the non-GMO certified label, you can't create that exemption for meat and dairy products, but the proponents wrote it in as an exemption. That is misleading, and it provides completely inaccurate information to consumers who may be looking for foods without GE ingredients in them. Right. It's just an indefensible position, and it ends up misleading consumers.
Eric, I'll let you jump in here.
So many questions. Where do I want to go? Let me start with picking up on where Dana left off. Should this really be a state issue? Even if there's an agreement that this is important, and I'm not sure there's an agreement, but even if there's an agreement this is important, should this be a state issue or a federal issue? I mean, can Colorado realistically have one standard and our neighboring states, Wyoming has a different standard, Kansas has a different standard, et cetera? Shouldn't this be handled at the federal level, Robin?
You know, that's a great question, Eric. And before I was a mother of four here in Colorado, I was a financial analyst that covered the food industry. And I tend to look at this, you know, what's in the best interest of business and how can we have free market decisions made here. And I think what we can all agree on is that nobody's got a lot of faith in anything getting done in Washington, D.C. right now. And as a result, what we've seen is 35 initiatives introduced in 20 states around the country. This isn't just Colorado that's doing this. It's already been passed in Connecticut, Maine, and Vermont. And I think, you know, in the absence of any type of activity at the federal level, which up until this point, it has been weak. It has been voluntary measures that have been suggested. The United Nations and the World Health Organization, their food standard groups, the American Medical Association is saying, you know, we need mandatory safety testing. The American Medical Association is calling for mandatory safety testing.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely they are. And in the absence of that, what we're seeing is the states start to take the initiative into their own hand. And it's not the first time we've seen this kind of legislative action at the state level. A perfect example is the seatbelt laws. You know, in the absence of any kind of federal legislation for the seatbelt laws, which we could all agree are pretty common sense law, just to be able to protect a consumer when they're in their car. In the absence of that legislation, New York actually became the first state to introduce a seatbelt law in 1984. And seatbelt laws are largely regulated at the state level. So, you know, here it is 2014. My opponent is basically suggesting that we adhere to the legislation that was introduced 20 years ago. And Colorado families know that the landscape of food has changed, and they know that the health of their families has changed, and they simply want to be able to make an informed choice.
Dana?
You know, the American Medical Association does not support the labeling of GMO foods, nor does the FDA,
I said they supported
nor does the World Health
testing.
Organization. And none of these organizations support the labeling of these foods because they know it's misleading and it can be inaccurate, like we're seeing in Proposition 105. But let's go back to your original point about should this be a federal standard. I think everybody can agree on some fundamental principles about labeling. It's got to be accurate, it's got to be reliable, and it should be consistent, and there shouldn't be the conflicts. Proposition 105 fails on all of those tests. I think that all consumers and farmers and food producers in the country should be treated equally, and that's why the national labeling standards are the ones that work. And there are currently 2 national labeling standards for consumers who prefer foods without GMOs. They can look for the organic or the non-GMO label. Both are reliable and both are accurate. And it's important to note that Proposition 105 conflicts with those. And it's the same thing, you know, if you think about it, if we do a state-by-state approach with this, you're going to have a patchwork quilt of all these different labeling laws. For example, Vermont is the only state that actually has a law that's been enacted and it's going into place. Proposition 105 conflicts with that law. So already food producers that are going to send foods to Colorado couldn't send the same food to Vermont. And like you said, if neighboring states were to pass it and they were slightly different, we could have 50 different states with 50 different labeling standards. Everyone should be treated fairly, and that's done under a national labeling standard.
Well, let's get to some more information and piggybacking on this to you, Robin. What labeling standards are already in place for food sold in Colorado?
You know, I think if you take a step back and you say, okay, what kind of information does a Colorado family need to protect their health? That's the bottom line. And in the absence of full transparency when it comes to these ingredients, I think what we're starting to see at the state level is that states around the country are saying, American food companies are providing this information to families overseas, and they're hiding it from us here.
But what's required here now?
As far as labeling goes.
Right.
A great example is USDA Organic. By law, if you adhere to the USDA Organic standard, you carry that seal, and it means that you have not used genetically engineered ingredients in those products, you have not used synthetic pesticides, you have not used things like sewage sludge. There's a lot we don't know about the way that our food is produced.
So
and that actually represents a legal,
national standard
that actually represents a
currently
legal
works.
standard. Again, this is a reasonable first step.
But as we're talking about, there are already the 2 national labeling standards that do provide the information to consumers already. But, and the market is at force. I mean, there are companies that are going to want to produce their foods without GMO ingredients for whatever reason. And they're guided by national standards that treat everybody, every consumer and producer equally.
Let me keep on this, because I'm just coming at this as a standard shopper. I walk into my grocery store and I go into the produce section. If I want non-GMO foods right now, I make that decision based on whatever I believe. If I go to the organic section and it says USDA Organic, am I getting non-GMO food?
Yes, you are.
By
So,
law, yes.
okay, so by law we agree with that. So if it doesn't have USDA Organic, I can assume it's not guaranteed non-GMO, right?
And the way this is written,
You
it's
have no
meant
way
to
of
be.
knowing.
It's meant to be the absence of a label is supposed to tell you that the absence of a label will tell you that there's no GMO in it. So let's say you're going to the grocery store and you go to get a carton of eggs. Well, you don't see a label on it, so you think, well, then it must be GMO free. The way that this is so poorly written, that's actually not true. It would be inaccurate information because it just got the special exemption. It came from an animal that was fed GE grains and injected with GE medication. Gets a special exemption. Another one is cheese. Cheese actually contains GE ingredients in it, but it got a special exemption. So you'd go to the store, you wouldn't see cheese or cheese products labeled, so you would assume it must not have GMOs in it. Well, that's not true. It just got a special exemption. There aren't all these loopholes and exemptions in the organic label and the non-GMO verified label.
And that's because of Colorado state law. State law only allows us to introduce one issue at a time. The
So
families from Colorado would understand
there's nothing in
that.
Colorado law that says you can't put a label on cheese which has GE in it. They've just made a special exemption. What you haven't heard the proponents answer is, why did you conflict with the federal organic and non-GMO verified label? Both of those don't allow those special exemptions. They made a special exemption for this. It doesn't make any sense. It's indefensible. I mean, the exemptions go so far as chewing gum. Chewing gum doesn't have to have a label on it, but breath mints do have to have a label on them. It doesn't make any sense. A can of beer doesn't have to have a label on it, but non-alcoholic beer does have to have a label. It just doesn't make any sense. It's completely
It does make
inaccurate
sense to
and
families in
misleading.
Colorado
Robin, you were
that
smiling there,
understand.
back in
It does make sense to Colorado families that understand state law. And again, when you really step back and you realize that this is our state's attempt to introduce this legislation to begin to educate the consumer, because as you just said, there is no way of knowing if those genetically engineered ingredients are in your food products unless it's labeled. And if you consider the fact that our farmers in Colorado have been growing this corn for 5 generations, and now there's this corn that's regulated by the EPA as a pesticide, and someone comes into our state and wants to stand in front of that right to know, this is just a fundamental right to know. It is a fundamental human right so that families in Colorado can make an informed choice. And on top of that, with these labels, you'll be able to collect data that is so valuable to our farmers, because right now companies like Chipotle are having to source their supply from other countries because the supply is not here in the state of Colorado. There's a huge economic opportunity right here for Colorado jobs, for Colorado farmers, for Colorado ranchers.
Here.
Let's talk.
Let me try to take it in a slightly different direction here. I'm going to make an assumption, might be wrong, but I'm going to make an assumption that at its core, this is not a debate about labeling, but this is a debate about genetically modified foods. And I also make one more assumption, which is that a lot of the movement in favor of this initiative is coming from maybe the left side of the political equation, which has a particular interest in helping people around the world. How, without GMO foods in this day and age and for the foreseeable future, do you take care of feeding the world's expanding population and hunger issues around the world? We'll start with you, Robin.
That's such a great question, Eric, and I will disclose that I was raised in a very Republican family, very conservative family, and I am of the belief that we let the free market decide. And in order to do that, we have to have full transparency. there is often that type of speculation that without this technology, we would not be able to feed the world. According to our own very own USDA and according to the United Nations, 30 to 40% of the food that is actually produced never reaches a human mouth. 64 of our key trading partners label these ingredients in the products that they sell. Our American food companies label these ingredients in the products that they sell overseas. Not only would this open export markets for Colorado farmers, but on top of that, to suggest in any way that this legislation blocks the ability to feed the world is also insinuating that countries like China and Russia and India and all of Europe, where this legislation has already been enacted, is in the way of that. And it is just a complete, it's completely wrong.
Tina?
Well, let's see. We talk a little bit about the other countries that have enacted this. You know, those are all countries. This is 1/50th of a country, so it's entirely different. And in fact, the EU, the scientific leaders of those countries are urging a reversal of the decision of placing the labeling on those products. But let's talk a little bit more about the exports, because I think what really matters here to Colorado farmers is exports. I mean, farmers are very sophisticated hands when it comes to the export market. They live and breathe it. And yet, the overwhelming majority of agricultural organizations in the state are urging a no vote, and it's because it hurts Colorado farmers. They would have to put a label on their products that they export to neighboring states as well. Same thing with Colorado food producers. So if they produce a product here in the state and they ship it off to Wyoming, it would have to have a label on it, and it competes with Wyoming products that doesn't have to have a label on it. That's why the farmers have come together and are urging a no vote. I do want to circle back on one other thing that Robin raised, and she was talking about some of the pesticides in the corn. Let's talk about that for just a second, because the one part, the fact that she forgot to include in there is the exact same pesticide is used by organic farmers because it is such a widely accepted and safe pesticide, and it is widely used in organic markets as well.
Well, let's get this back to the organic question, because I guess I understand your point about being free market, letting the free market decide. If I'm thinking there's a trend towards people thinking that GMOs might be harmful, and I want to sell my turnips GMO free, I would want to just have the label saying I'm GMO free. I'm not really sure I would be worried about the farmer next door that can't put a label on his or her turnips that says whether or not. If I know that I'm GMO free, that would perceivably give me an advantage, just like it has been for different supermarkets opening up that specialize in organic food. Why is it that the labeling isn't reversed, that the labeling is mandated, hey, if you're non-GMO free, there's the label, so that would be an advantage in the marketplace and not the other way around?
Because I think it's a fundamental human right to know what you're feeding your family. You know, earlier this year, for 100 days, I worked with 2 Colorado families that are on food stamps. And you try telling them that they need to shop in that organic aisle. They can't afford to, they're on food stamps. They want to know what's going into the food that they're feeding their family. And this is simply full transparency on that. And you know, Dana brings up a great point on that, corn. Any parent that buys any vegetable or fruit in the grocery store knows that you rinse it and you're able to rinse it off. But when something has been genetically engineered at the cellular level of a plant, there's no way to rinse it off. So at the very least, inform us that that's going into our food.
You know, you make a good point about the label, that it's a reverse label. You know, we label things that they're gluten-free, not that it's made with gluten. We say that it's sugar-free or low-calorie or whatever, you know, kosher. Those are the labels that you have. Not only do they tell you the affirmative, but they also are accurate and reliable. You know, I'm the mother of 3 kids. Like all mothers, I spend a lot of time in the grocery store, and I need the labels to be accurate, because one thing I have found is little kids and sugar are oftentimes not a very good combination. So I look at those labels. I need it to be accurate. So let's say I go to look at a box of granola bars and I see that there's no sugar in it. Then I think it's a terrific item for my family. What if I then found out, well, granola bars just got a special exemption. That's why the sugar wasn't labeled. That's where Proposition 105 fails, is it because it doesn't provide that consistent information. It doesn't tell you which ingredients were genetically engineered and how much of the product is genetically engineered, and you don't know if it got a special exemption.
Eric?
Let's talk a little bit about this campaign. I'm curious where your support is coming from on both sides of this equation. We've been starting with Robin, so maybe we'll start this one with Dana. newspaper endorsements, major organizational endorsements. Who's behind the No campaign here?
You will find that part of the No Coalition is built up largely of the farmer base here in the state of Colorado. I mean, you're going to have everybody from the Colorado Farm Bureau to the local farm bureaus and the Cattlemen Association, the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. You're going to find a broad coalition of folks, and I think the reason you'll find that is because they know that this hurts the Colorado farmers. I mean, because there is a zero tolerance written into Proposition 105, that means there can be not any commingling of the products. Well, what that means is for farmers who are farming, let's say, a GMO crop and a non-GMO crop, they have to have two completely separate systems of farming because to comply with the zero tolerance. Well, that's an enormous cost, an enormous burden for farmers, particularly the sugar beet farmers here in the state. I mean, it's one of the biggest crops here in the state. That's why the farmers have come together to urge a no vote. That and the food producers as well, having to put a label on their product that is sold in neighboring states where no other food producer in the entire country has to comply with that regulation. It puts farmers and food producers at a competitive disadvantage.
And Robin, who's newspaper endorsements, who's supporting the Proponents campaign here?
Well, you know, Dana wouldn't know this since she's just flown in from Seattle, but Colorado families and Colorado parents and Colorado grandparents stand strongly behind this because we are the ones every day feeding our families here in this state. We've had the usual endorsements, which you would expect, but I really think when it comes to
such as
the Democratic Party, I mean, there have been others just around the state. If you go to
Colorado
the Colorado
Democratic Party?
Yeah, the Colorado Democrat Party. If you go to the Right to Know website, you can see the endorsements there. But really, I think this is a fundamental human rights issue, and it is one of the most patriotic issues of our time, and it's why we're seeing families really step into this debate. I am a Colorado mother of 4. No one is more concerned about these kinds of initiatives and the long-term impact that it's going to have on our kids and the long-term impact that it's going to have on our state and on our economy. We live here. Our children go to school here. We understand the impact it has on the entire state budget, and we understand the impact it would have on everything in that budget, including the school system.
We have limited time. We get to do our closing statements in just over a minute. So this is a shorter question. This is a proposition. If it is passed, it goes to it can be changed as a statute by the legislature. Robin, we'll start with you. Are you fearful that it's going to be changed by the legislature that has not enacted this law? And then we'll get the same question to you.
I'm not fearful. I just look at this as an opportunity for Colorado families to engage in democracy. You know, this is a human right we have not been given as a country. And the movement and the agitation that we're seeing at the state level with 35 pieces of legislation that have been introduced is simply families stepping in and saying, we want this fundamental human right. It is the beginning of a conversation. It is a reasonable first start for a state law that only allows one issue. Do I wish Colorado state law allowed for a greater amendment to be introduced at this time? Absolutely, yes. But unfortunately, that's the constraint we have here in the state of Colorado.
Dana, does the fight continue in the legislature since this would be a proposition if it passes?
You know, voters are voting on what is, not what could be, and that is what's written on that piece of paper, and that's what they have to vote on, not maybe how the legislature may fix this with all the flaws and the exemption and chewing gum not labeled and other exemptions that they have that are just nonsensical and indefensible. Voters are voting on what it is, and it is a poorly written initiative that gives inaccurate information at the grocery store, and it increases the cost of groceries.
Well, as I said, a half hour goes by incredibly quickly around here. We know that very personally. It's time for closing statements. You each have 1 minute to give your closing statement to the voters. Robin, we picked numbers out of a hat before we started. You picked first, so your 1 minute closing statement.
Well, thank you. I would just like to reach out to Colorado families, Colorado parents and grandparents, and the Colorado farmers. I'm actually named after a farmer. She's my godmother. And to dismiss any of the concerns that might be had by the farming community would be absolutely insane for the state of Colorado and our economy. This initiative simply gives Colorado families an informed choice when it comes to feeding their loved ones. The landscape of the health of our families has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Today we're dealing with things none of us want to be dealing with, whether it's food allergies or autism or cancer or Parkinson's disease. We are dealing with these conditions and we want to know how our food is produced. We know if milk is pasteurized, we know if orange juice comes from concentrate, we know what allergens are in our food and what fat and what sugar content. This is simply a reasonable first step to begin that conversation, to initiate the change, so that Colorado can be at the forefront of this movement. To have this backward-looking anti-labeling initiative in place takes us back 20 years. We are on this landscape in the 21st century today, and this meets the needs and begins to address the changing needs of Colorado families today.
Thank you, Robin. Dana, your 1 minute closing statement.
Thank you very much for the voters who joined us tonight for this very important discussion. You know, what we have here is a poorly written initiative, and the proponents say it's about the right to know, but apparently it's about the right to know only when they say, and they exempted 2/3 of the food that is sold here in the state, and that's just indefensible exemptions that end up providing misleading and inaccurate information to all consumers. And what ends up happening then is it increases the cost of groceries for everybody, because this is a single state labeling policy. You know, there's a reason why nearly every major farming organization and farmer in this state urges a no vote on Proposition 105. It's because it's costly and it hurts family farmers in this state. And it's also costly to taxpayers as well. You know, it's important to notice that taxpayers are going to have to be the one who regulate and enforce this through state agencies. There's no taxpayer limit that what can be spent on the enforcement, and there's no funding source available as well. It's a costly, misleading measure, and it deserves a no vote.
Thank you both. That is all the time we have to look at Proposition 105. I'd like to thank our representatives for joining us, Robin O'Brien and Dana Bieber.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, Eric Sonderman, as always. If you'd like to find out more information about any of the races or ballot issues on this November's ballot, please visit our websites at cpt12.org or cbs4denver.com. Be sure to stay tuned as we take a look at Amendment 68, which would expand gaming at horse racetracks in Colorado, coming up next. For everyone here at Colorado Public Television, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks for watching.